Snow drifted sideways through the open-air station, blurring the iron rails and softening the sharp edges of the world. Christmas Day had stripped the place of its usual noise. No vendors shouting, no children laughing, only the distant groan of a freight train somewhere beyond the white curtain. The rancher stood near the platform edge with his hands buried in his coat pockets, boots planted like he might root himself there if he stayed still enough. He hadn't planned to be here. He rarely planned anything anymore. Loneliness had nudged him out the door before dawn, whispered that movement was better than sitting in a house that echoed his own breathing. The scarf around his neck was thick, hand-knit, a faded green that no longer matched anything he owned. He'd wrapped it once, tight, the way he did when the wind cut too deep. It had been a gift years ago, back when gifts came with voices and laughter attached. He watched his breath bloom and vanish, counting seconds between trains that weren't coming, telling himself he'd ride the next one no matter where it went. That was when he heard the voice. It wasn't loud, it didn't demand attention, it slipped into the space beside him like a confession. "My son's cold, can I borrow your scarf?" The pause before the question stretched, thin as the ice forming along the platform edge. He turned slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter the moment. The woman stood a few steps away, her coat too light for the weather, its buttons mismatched like they'd been replaced over time with whatever could be found. She held a small boy against her chest, his head tucked beneath her chin. His hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, curls plastered to his forehead. One of his gloves dangled from a string, lost somewhere between the station and the hope of warmth. His breathing came shallow and fast, each exhale a faint cloud that faded too quickly. The rancher's first instinct was to refuse, not out of cruelty, but habit. He'd learned to protect what little warmth he carried. The scarf was practical, necessary. Winter didn't forgive sentiment. He felt the old tightening in his chest, the reflex to step back into himself. The woman's eyes flicked to the scarf, then away, as if embarrassed by the asking. She adjusted her grip on the boy, rocking slightly, her shoulders braced against disappointment she clearly expected. He noticed the details then, the cracked skin on her knuckles, the way her boots were soaked through at the seams, the tremor she couldn't still no matter how tightly she held her child. She smelled faintly of cold wool and something medicinal, like menthol rubbed on small chests at night. The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and he coughed once, a thin sound that cut sharper than the wind. Something shifted. The rancher unwound the scarf without thinking too much about it. The wool slid free, releasing the heat it had trapped, and the cold bit immediately at his neck. He crouched so he wouldn't loom, boots creaking on the frozen boards. "Hey there," he said softly, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. He looped the scarf around the boy's neck, careful not to press too tight, tucking the ends the way someone once had for him on a morning just as cold, long before he'd learned to stand alone. The boy leaned into the warmth instinctively, a small sigh escaping him as if his body recognized safety before his mind could. The woman's breath hitched. She pressed her lips together, nodding once, twice, like she was afraid words would spill something fragile. "Thank you," she whispered, the syllables barely there, already misting into the air. They stood like that for a moment, snow falling between them, the station holding its breath. The rancher straightened, his neck stinging where the cold had claimed its place. He didn't miss the scarf the way he thought he would. Instead, he felt oddly lighter, as if he'd set something down he'd been carrying too long. The train schedule board flickered and went dark again. Christmas bells rang faintly from town, carried on the wind. And in that quiet, on a platform meant for departures, three strangers found themselves paused together, waiting for something none of them had planned to find. They sat together on the long wooden bench beneath the station awning, the wind hissing through the gaps in the boards like a warning the world couldn't stop giving. The rancher kept his hands folded between his knees, feeling the cold creep up his collar where the scarf had been. Across from him, the woman shifted the boy so his head rested against her shoulder, the borrowed green wool snug around his neck. The color made his flushed cheeks stand out, a living ember in the gray morning. For a while, none of them spoke. Silence had weight, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just careful, like they were all afraid of breaking something newly formed. The boy's breathing was uneven, a faint rattle beneath the wind. The woman counted each rise and fall of his chest with her eyes, her mouth moving soundlessly, perhaps a prayer, perhaps numbers to keep fear from taking over. The rancher reached for the thermos in his coat pocket, hesitated, then unscrewed the lid and held it out. "It's just tea," he said, as if apologizing for the simplicity of the offer. She accepted it with both hands, nodding again. Steam rose between them like a small miracle. She took a careful sip, then another, color returning slowly to her fingers. When she handed it back, her eyes finally met his, and something in them softened, gratitude mixed with exhaustion so deep it looked permanent. "His name's Oliver," she said quietly, brushing the boy's hair back from his damp forehead. "He's had this fever since last night." She paused, swallowing. "I thought getting to my sister's would help. She has a stove that works. Medicine. I just missed the early train." He nodded, the story slotting into him without effort. He knew missed trains. He knew plans that fell apart despite all the hoping. "I'm Henry," he said after a moment. Saying his name felt strange, like opening a door he rarely used. The delay announcement crackled over the loudspeaker, distorted by static. Another hour. Maybe two. The woman closed her eyes briefly, shoulders sagging under the weight of it. Henry watched her brace herself, watched how quickly she gathered the pieces of her resolve back into place. He recognized that, too, the way people learned to stand again because there was no one else to do it for them. She spoke in fragments after that, as if telling the story in full might cost too much. Her husband had died the previous winter, an accident on an icy road. She'd taken work where she could find it, packing, cleaning, moving whenever the rent rose or the walls grew too thin with memory. Oliver had been strong until the cold snapped in early, until nights grew sharper than she could manage alone. "I didn't want to ask," she said, eyes on the snow. "About the scarf. Or anything. You did right," Henry said, surprising himself again. The words felt solid once they were out. The boy stirred, a small whimper escaping him. Henry stood without thinking and shrugged out of his coat, draping it over Oliver's legs. The woman protested softly, but he shook his head. "I've got enough layers," he said. It was true, in ways she couldn't see. They waited, the station clock ticking louder than it should have. Henry told her about the ranch, how it sat far from town, how winters were long but honest. He didn't mention the empty rooms or the table set for one. She listened the way people listen when they haven't been listened to in a long time. In return, she told him small things about Oliver, how he loved trains, how he counted cows from car windows, how he believed Christmas miracles were quieter than people expected. When the loudspeaker crackled again, announcing yet another delay, Henry felt something settle in his chest, heavy and certain. He looked at the woman, at the boy wrapped in borrowed warmth, at the snow piling up like the world was closing doors one by one. "You don't have to keep moving tonight," he said. The words felt dangerous and right all at once. "There's a place not far from here. Fire's always on. You can rest. Let him get warm." She stared at him, fear and hope colliding in her eyes. Trust was a leap, especially on Christmas Day. Outside, bells rang faintly again, and the wind carried them between breaths. Henry waited, knowing that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't offering help, but standing still long enough for someone to decide to take it. They left the station just as dusk began to settle, the sky bruised purple and gray, snow still falling but softer now, as if the storm itself were tired. Henry walked slightly ahead, carrying one small bag the woman insisted wasn't heavy, though it clearly was. She followed carefully, Oliver bundled in Henry's coat and scarf, his head resting against her shoulder, breaths finally slowing into something closer to sleep. Each step away from the station felt like crossing a line neither of them had known existed an hour earlier. The ranch lay beyond the last stretch of town, where streetlights gave up and the world returned to shadow and snow. When the house came into view, its windows glowed with a steady amber light. The sight of it caught the woman off guard. She stopped for a moment, as if afraid the warmth might vanish if she moved too quickly toward it. Henry noticed and waited, snow collecting on his hat, giving her the time she needed. Inside, the house welcomed them with the dry crackle of the fire and the familiar smell of wood smoke and soup that had been simmering since morning. Henry moved with quiet efficiency, the practiced motions of a man who'd learned to take care of himself because there was no one else to do it. He set Oliver gently on the couch near the hearth, layering blankets over him, checking his forehead with the back of his hand. The boy stirred but didn't wake, his small fingers clutching the green scarf like an anchor. The woman hovered, unsure where to place herself, hands twisting together. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, voice barely above the fire's hiss. Henry shook his head. "You're not," he replied simply. He ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the table, tearing bread with his hands instead of cutting it, the way he always did when he wanted food to feel less formal. "Eat," he added, gently but firmly. She sat, tears threatening as soon as the spoon touched her lips. Warmth spread across her face, down her arms, into places that had been cold for far too long. She ate slowly, like someone afraid the comfort might run out if she rushed it. Henry poured her tea, then retreated a step, giving her space without leaving. He understood that kind of balance, how closeness could soothe or overwhelm depending on how it was offered. Later, when Oliver whimpered in his sleep, she rushed to him, but Henry was already there, adjusting the blanket, murmuring something low and steady. The boy settled again, the fever seeming to loosen its grip under the steady heat. She watched Henry in that moment, the care in his movements, the instinctive tenderness he didn't try to hide. It struck her then that he was lonely in a way that matched her own, not loud or desperate, but deep and patient. Outside, church bells rang from the distant town, clear now in the cold air. Christmas, announcing itself whether people were ready or not. Henry stood by the window, listening, memories pressing close, holidays long past, chairs no longer filled, laughter that had faded into the walls. For years, he'd treated Christmas like any other day, something to be endured. Tonight, it felt different, heavier and brighter all at once. The woman joined him at the window, keeping a respectful distance. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said. Henry looked down at Oliver, sleeping peacefully, then back at her. "You already did," he answered. "You asked." The truth of it surprised him as much as it seemed to ease her. When it grew late, he showed her the spare room, clean but rarely used. Fresh sheets waited in the cupboard, folded with care. "Stay as long as you need," he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. She nodded, unable to speak, one hand pressed to her mouth. Before turning in, Henry noticed the scarf still wrapped around Oliver's neck. He started to reach for it, then stopped. The scarf belonged where it was. In the quiet that followed, with snow blanketing the world outside and a small family sleeping under his roof, Henry understood something simple and profound: the scarf hadn't been alone. It had been an opening. And on a Christmas he'd expected to pass alone, warmth had found him again, not something to guard, but something to share, and in sharing, to finally keep.